Core Set 2021 brings with it the continuation of a cycle of cards started over 15 years ago, in 2004, way back in Champions of Kamigawa. That's right, we finally got some more shrines. So in this deck tech, we're going to discuss how to put together a budget 5-color shrine deck for less than $75. This deck is going to be sort of a mix between a combo deck and an ultra value deck that makes tons of mana and draws you tons of cards. So if that sounds like your jam, 5-color shrine tribal might just be the deck for you. But if you don't already know, you might be asking, what are shrines in MTG? Well, there's 11 shrines in all, and there's a few different types of shrines. For the first type, we have the Hondens. These are the first 5 original shrines from back in Kamigawa, and they all work in pretty much the same way. All 5 of the Hondens have abilities that trigger on your upkeep, and all of their abilities count the number of shrines you have total and then give you some sort of bonus for each one. Take Honden of Seeing Winds for example. At the beginning of our upkeep, we count the number of shrines we have, and then we draw that many cards. So, if Honden of Seeing Winds is our only shrine, we only draw 1 extra card. But if we have 5 shrines on the battlefield, we get to draw 5 extra cards every turn before our normal draw step. So the key strategy of our deck will be getting as many shrines as possible onto the battlefield, as they all power each other up exponentially by being on the battlefield at the same time, just by increasing our shrine count. The second type of shrines are Sanctums with triggered abilities. These work pretty similar to Hondens with one slight difference. Sanctums trigger at the beginning of our main phase, rather than on our upkeep. Or to put it more simply, Hondens trigger before we draw our normal card for the turn, and Sanctums trigger after we draw our normal card for the turn. A lot of times this difference won't really matter, but there are some cases where it will, and we'll cover that in a bit. And then the third and final type of shrine is Sanctums with activated abilities. These shrines are pretty different compared to the first two. Instead of having an ability that just triggers near the start of each of our turns, they have an ability that we can just activate whenever we feel like it during anybody's turn. Sanctum of Tranquil Light, for example, lets us tap down our opponent's creatures anytime we want. And just like our shrines with triggered abilities, this third type of shrine also gets powered up by having more shrines in the battlefield. In Sanctum of Tranquil Light's case, by reducing the cost of its activated ability, potentially all the way down to just costing 1 white mana to tap down anything, which is a pretty powerful way to shut down our opponent's commanders or other scary creature threats they may have. We can also divide our shrines into 2 different categories. Enabler shrines, which are shrines that we mostly are just running because, well, they're shrines, and payoff shrines, which are really shrines that give us a huge benefit for having a large number of shrines on the battlefield. Essentially, the payoff shrines make running the enabler shrines worth it, because even if those enabler shrines aren't nearly as powerful as the payoff ones, they help us reach the critical mass of shrines we need to really take over the game. And that's not to say that there won't be situations where our enabler shrines are great. Honden of Cleansing Fire, for example, is generally more of an enabler and not really a great payoff for our shrines, because it just gains us 2 life on our upkeep for each shrine we have, and something like drawing cards or dealing damage is just generally a better payoff than life gain. But there will be some games where our life is low and we're about to die, and suddenly Honden of Cleansing Fire gaining us 16, 18, 20 life will make it the best card in our entire deck. In fact, the very best and most key card in our entire deck is an enabler shrine, and that card is Sanctum of All. Sanctum of All is a legendary enchantment shrine that costs Wooburg to cast, so that's 1 of each color of mana, white, blue, black, red, and green. Sanctum of All's ability says, at the beginning of our upkeep, we may search our library and or our graveyard for a shrine card and put it onto the battlefield. And then it has a second ability that says, if an ability of another shrine we control triggers while we control 6 or more shrines, that ability triggers an additional time. So, on each of our upkeeps, Sanctum of All lets us tutor whatever shrine we want out of our deck and put it directly onto the battlefield. And that by itself is insanely powerful. But once we hit 6 shrines, it also turns into a Shrine Panharmonicon, doubling up the abilities of all of our shrines with triggered abilities. For example, if we have 6 shrines on the battlefield, instead of Honden of Seeing Winds drawing us 6 cards, it'll trigger twice and draw us 12 cards. Sanctum of All works best with the new Sanctums, those shrines with abilities that trigger at the beginning of our main phase. For example, on our upkeep, using Sanctum of All's search ability, we can pull Sanctum of Calm Waters directly onto the battlefield. Then we go to our draw step, draw our normal card for the turn, and then we proceed to our main phase. And then, that Sanctum of Calm Waters we just put onto the battlefield will trigger, letting us use its ability on the same turn that we tutored it out of our deck. This doesn't work quite the same with old Hondens. If we go grab Honden of Night's Reach, for example, it won't trigger on the same turn, because by the time it hits the battlefield, the beginning of our upkeep has already passed for the turn. However, there is some trickiness we can do with the old Hondens and with Sanctum of All. Say that we only only have Sanctum of All and Honden Knight's Reach on the battlefield. We go to the start of our upkeep and both of these shrines trigger. So, since there's 2 shrines on the battlefield, Honden of Knight's Reach is going to make one of our opponents discard 2 cards. But, because Sanctum of All and Honden of Knight's Reach both trigger at the same time, we get to choose the order that those abilities resolve in. So what we do is we choose to let Sanctum of All resolve first, and we go grab another shrine out of our deck. After that, we let Honden of Knight's Reach's ability resolve, and when it checks how many shrines are on the battlefield, it'll also count that one we just tutored with Sanctum of All. So instead of 2 cards, an opponent's going to have to discard 3 cards. So even though the new Sanctums technically work better with Sanctum of All, by stacking our triggers so that Sanctum of All resolves first, we can still power up our existing Hondens with it. And one more important thing to note about Sanctum of All is that it allows us to pull any shrine from either our deck or our graveyard. So if some disaster happens and an opponent just casts Back to Nature and blows up all 10 of our other shrines, as long as we have Sanctum of All, we can pull those shrines back out of the graveyard and rebuild. We also have some other ways to bring shrines back out of the graveyard, like Dance the Manse, but having this recursion built into Sanctum of All, which is kinda like our pseudo commander, is really nice to have against any disruption. Now, I called Sanctum of All our pseudo commander, but it can't actually go into our command zone because it's a legendary enchantment, not a legendary creature. So who actually is our commander? Well, there's actually a perfect 5-color commander for Shrine Tribal, and that's Sisay, Weatherlight Captain. Sisay, Weatherlight Captain is a 2/2 legendary creature, human soldier that costs 2 and a white to cast. Sisay gets +1/+1 for each color among other legendary permanents that we control. And then Sisay has an activated ability that costs Wooburg. Again, that means 1 mana of each color, so white, blue, black, red, and green. By paying Wooburg, we can search our library for a legendary permanent card with a converted mana cost less than Sisay's power, and put that card directly onto the battlefield. And because Sisay has that Wooburg activated ability, even though her casting cost is only 2 and a white, the cost of that ability technically means that she has all 5 colors in her color identity. Meaning with Sisay as our commander, we can run all 11 shrines in our deck. Sisay is perfect as a shrine commander because all of our shrines are legendary. That means not only can we use Sisay's ability to tutor our shrines out of our deck and onto the battlefield, but also every time we play a shrine, it's going to boost Sisay's power and toughness if it's a color of a legendary permanent that we don't already have. For example, if we have Sanctum of All on the battlefield, it's a legendary permanent that hits all 5 colors by itself, making Sisay a 7/7 for 3. And all of our shrines cost 5 or less mana, so if we can get Sisay up to at least 6 power, we can use her ability to go grab any of them out of our deck. But shrines aren't the only legendary permanents we can tutor up with Sisay. Legendary Matters is one of the core strategies of our deck. So our deck is a toolbox filled with all sorts of legendary goodies that can buff up our Sisay or be tutored out of the deck by her. Tuvasa the Sunlit is a legendary 1/1 creature that costs green, white, blue to cast. Tuvasa gets +1/+1 for each enchantment we control, and more importantly, Tuvasa draws us a card for each enchantment we cast each turn. All of our shrines are enchantments, so we get to draw a card whenever we cast any of them with Tuvasa on the battlefield. And Enchantress is another big theme of our deck that we'll talk about in a bit. So having what's essentially a legendary Enchantress that we can tutor up with our commander is pretty huge. We're also running Zur the Enchanter, a legendary flying 1/4 that costs 1 white, black, blue to cast. Whenever Zur attacks, we can go grab any enchantment out of our deck that costs 3 or less and put it directly into play. And about half of our shrines cost 3 CMC or less, so Zur is an awesome legend for our arsenal. Umori is a legendary ooze that costs 2 and 2 hybrid green-black mana. Umori has some text about companions that we really don't care about because we're running him in our main deck, not as a companion. But what we do care about is that when Umori comes into play, we can name a card type, and then all spells we cast with that card type cost 1 less to play. In our case, we're almost always going to be naming enchantments with Umori, which means all of our shrines and all of our other 30ish enchantments in our deck are going to be 1 mana cheaper for us to cast, and knocking the cost of a spell down by 1 mana tends to be pretty darn strong. Arasta of the Endless Web is more of a silver bullet legend that we can tutor up with Sisay when we need to. Specifically, Arasta is really good when one or more of our opponents is running some kind of spell slinger deck. Arasta gives us a 1/2 green spider with reach every time an opponent casts an instant or a sorcery, which is just generally fine in Commander, because with 3 opponents instead of 1, you're probably going to have just a pretty good number of instants and sorceries that are casted anyway. But if you have an opponent whose deck is built around slinging spells, casting a ton of instants and sorceries every turn, Arasta can go from pretty good to really backbreaking. So having Arasta in our toolbox and findable by our commander whenever we need it is a really great and kinda coincidental way to punish those archetypes. But remember, Sisay works with any legendary permanents, not just creatures, and that includes all planeswalkers. So we've got a few planeswalkers in our deck as well. We're running both Estrid and Calyx, both planeswalkers that work great with enchantments, and in our deck that means they work great with shrines. Estrid in particular is quite a powerful planeswalker in our deck with multiple applications. First and foremost, by using Estrid's minus ability, we can create a mask token with totem armor and attach it to any permanent we control. Totem armor works by protecting the card that it's enchanting. So if we put a mask in our Honden of Seeing Winds and our opponent tries to destroy it, instead the Honden will survive and only the mask will be destroyed. So we can use Estrid to protect our most important payoff shrines with potentially multiple layers of masks. Estrid can also ramp up our mana by putting her masks on lands. Land destruction isn't super common in Commander, so the mask probably won't be protecting the land all that much, but Estrid's +2 ability says we can untap each enchanted permanent that we control. So say we -1 Estrid and put a mask on our forest. Then, next turn we can tap that forest for a mana, +2 Astrid, which will untap our enchanted forest, and then tap it again, doubling up the mana it produces. But Estrid's +2 is especially powerful in our deck because we're already running a ton of enchantment-based ramp. Fertile Ground, for example, is a 2-mana enchantment that we can put on any land, and when that land is tapped for mana, we get to make a second mana of any color. So we can put Fertile Ground on our forest, tap it for a green mana and let's say a white mana, then we can +2 our Estrid, which will untap the forest because it's enchanted by Fertile Ground. Then we can tap it for 2 more mana, let's say a red and a green. That's 4 mana from one forest, and when we have multiple lands enchanted, we can really start making just a ton of mana with Estrid. So through this combo with Estrid and the enchantment-based ramp we're running, Estrid can really pull double duty as protection for our key shrines and also an extremely potent source of ramp. Running on these legendary creatures and planeswalkers also means that we have access to legendary sorceries. Legendary sorceries can only be cast if we control a legendary creature or a planeswalker, but thanks to our bevy of both of those, casting legendary sorceries should really be no issue for us. Urza's Ruinous Blast is an extremely powerful board wipe. It exiles, not destroys, exiles all non-land, non-legendary permanents. That means Urza's Ruinous Blast can wipe away even indestructible threats like Blightsteel Colossus, while leaving our legendary permanents, including our shrines, untouched. One of the single most powerful spells in our deck is another legendary sorcery, Kamal's Druidic Vow. Kamal's Druidic Vow costs green, and X, and says look at the top X cards of your library. You may put any number of land cards and or legendary permanent cards with a converted mana cost X or less from among them onto the battlefield. Put the rest into your graveyard. That means Druidic Vow lets us put all of our shrines, all of our legends, all of our planeswalkers, all of our other legendary permanents, and all the lands that we hit that cost X or less directly onto the battlefield. And Druidic Vow doesn't even put the lands into play tapped, meaning we can pour all of our mana into Druidic Vow, and afterwards, all the untapped lands that we put onto the battlefield will allow us to keep casting spells and just going the heck off. And besides our commander, we also have other legendary tutors like Thalia's Lancers. And Lancers lets us go and grab any legendary card, so it works as a tutor for both our legendary permanents and our legendary sorceries. All of the legendary permanents we're running gives us access to a really unique, really powerful ramp spell in the form of Honor Worm Shaku. Shaku is a 3-mana mana rock that taps for 1 colorless mana by itself, but we can also tap any legendary permanent we control to untap Honor Worn Shaku. This means that every turn, Honor Worn Shaku can essentially add X colorless mana to our mana pool, where X is 1 plus the number of legendary permanents that we control. This is really busted in our deck because while tapping down your legendary creature instead of attacking with it is a real cost, we're running a bunch of like legendary shrines and planeswalkers and other legendary enchantments which don't care about being tapped down at all. So every single turn, Shaku can add an absolute ton of mana for us for really no additional cost. And speaking of other legendary enchantments besides our shrines, the next big theme of our deck, as we talked about before, is enchantments. We're running some really awesome utility enchantments that also just so happen to be legendary, letting us capitalize on both our legendary synergies and our enchantment synergies. Arguel's Bloodfast is a legendary enchantment that lets us trade some life for some sweet card draw. Fance's Blasting Cannons is a legendary enchantment that basically draws us a second card every turn, although make a note that we can't play lands we hit off of Blasting Cannons, so any lands that it exiles are just gone, but it's still really good. And Profane Procession is a legendary enchantment that does nothing on its own, but with it on the battlefield we can pay 5 mana and exile any creature. 5 mana to remove one creature is a little steep at first, but once we get our shrines to the battlefield, once we get our Shaku onto the battlefield, we're just generating oodles and oodles of mana. Having a mana sink like Profane Procession to exile our opponent's commanders and other creature threats with is very powerful. And these legendary enchantments eventually flip over, transforming into powerful legendary lands. One thing to note about Profane Procession in particular is that while Profane Procession is supposed to flip over after we've exiled 3 creatures with it, supposedly limiting Profane Procession to only dealing with 3 creatures. That's that's only if the 3 cards we've exiled with it actually stay exiled. If we snipe our opponent's commanders with Profane Procession and they choose to put their commanders back into the command zone instead of being exiled, which they pretty much always will, that technically doesn't count as one of the 3 exiles, and we can keep our 1-card removal engine online. A couple of other legendary permanents that we're running is Oath of Nissa, which basically just draws us a card and then fixes our mana for our planeswalkers forever, and In Bolas's Clutches. In Bolas's Clutches is a legendary enchantment that lets us steal any permanent on the battlefield. That's stealing any creature, any enchantment, any artifact, any land, even stealing our opponent's commanders if we want. That's uber powerful in our deck because we can pull it directly out of our deck and into play with our commander. And so the ability to just steal any permanent we need to at the drop of a hat is really powerful. But outside of legendary enchantments, we also just have some general enchantment payoffs. We're running a ton of enchantresses, which are creatures that draw us cards every time we cast an enchantment spell. All of our shrines are enchantments, of course, but also a huge chunk of our deck, about half, is also enchantments. So being able to draw a card every time we cast most of the spells in our deck is very powerful, as it means we're probably never going to be running out of action. And once we get 2 or 3 enchantresses on the battlefield, we can really go off and gorge ourselves on the sweet, sweet nectar of card draw. We even have some enchantresses that are enchantments, like Enchantress's Presence and Eidolon Blossoms. These are especially great because not only are they a payoff for enchantments, they also benefit from our other enchantment payoffs, being enchantments themselves. And we even have some enchantresses that serve as finishers in our deck, like Tuvasa and Cetessan Champion. Tuvasa isn't quite a full-on enchantress, as she only triggers for the first enchantment we cast each turn, but drawing an extra card every turn is still really strong. And once we get 5, 10, 15 enchantments on the battlefield, Tuvasa is going to be a 6/6, an 11/11, a 16/16, and she'll be smashing our opponent's faces in. Cetessan Champion can similarly climb to a huge power and toughness and can be a huge problem for our opponent's life totals. Although Cetessan Champion isn't quite the finisher Tuvasa is, because while Cetessan Champion is a true enchantress that draws us cards for every enchantment we cast instead of just the first, Cetessan Champion needs to be on the battlefield before we start casting our enchantments to accumulate +1/+1 counters. While with Tuvasa, we can just immediately slam her onto the board as like a 10/10 plus if we've got enough enchantments. We're also running some ramp creatures that reduce the cost of our enchantments, like Herald of the Pantheon and Starfield Mystic. Similar to Umori, these two can make our 4-mana enchantments cost 3, our 3-mana enchantments cost 2, and so on and so on. And when we get multiple of these cost reducers on the battlefield, we can start casting our enchantments for almost nothing. These cost reducers are really powerful if we have an enchantress on the battlefield, because the reduced casting cost plus the card draw means we can potentially start chain casting one enchantment into another, letting us have some really explosive turns. We're also running enchantment tutors like Idyllic Tutor as a way to grab whatever enchantment we need from our deck. We can go grab any shrine we need, or maybe grab Kindred's Transformation if we need to shut down one of our opponent's commanders, or maybe Ruined Halo if there's a particular threat we need to save ourselves from, or maybe Seal of Primordium if there's an artifact or an enchantment that needs to go. Having so much of our deck as enchantments means Idyllic Tutor is pretty close to a Demonic Tutor, letting us find a silver bullet answer to most situations. And Dance of the Manse is a way we can potentially reanimate an absolute ton of enchantments out of our graveyard. Dance costs white, blue, and X, and says return up to X target artifacts and or enchantments with converted mana cost X or less from your graveyard to the battlefield, and if X is 6 or more, they come back as big 4/4 creatures as well. So if we make a ton of mana and cast Dance for, let's say, X equals 10, we get to pull 10 enchantments out of our graveyard as 4/4 enchantment creatures, not only getting the benefits from all those enchantments, but also giving us a huge army to kill our opponent with. So if our opponents have destroyed a bunch of our shrines or other enchantments, Dance is a great way to get them back, but once we get our shrine engine going, we can pretty easily be drawing 5, 10 cards per turn off of Sanctum of Calm Waters and Sanctum of Seeing Winds, and we'll need to discard down to 7 cards at the end of our turn. So we're pretty good at getting a lot of enchantments in our graveyard, even without our opponent's help. And Dance of the Manse lets us actually turn that into a win condition. And speaking of win conditions, let's talk about some of the primary ways our Shrine Tribal deck has of actually finishing out the game. A really powerful finisher in our deck is Ominous Seas. Ominous Seas is a 2-mana enchantment that says, whenever we draw a card, we put a Foreshadow counter on Ominous Seas. We can remove 8 Foreshadow counters from Ominous Seas at any time to create a huge 8/8 Kraken token. And we don't have to sacrifice Ominous Seas to do so, just remove 8 counters. So we can keep drawing more cards with our shrines and our enchantresses, putting more and more counters on Ominous Seas, and flooding the board with a ton of 8/8 Krakens. And in the early game, if we're missing our land drops or missing our ramp, we can even cycle away Ominous Seas for only 2 mana, and then we can just get it back later with something like Dance of the Manse. Similar to Ominous Seas, but even more powerful, we've got Sigil of the Empty Throne and Shark Typhoon. Sigil just straight up gives us a 4/4 flying angel every single time we cast an enchantment spell. And Shark Typhoon gives us an XX flying shark every time we cast a non-creature spell, like our enchantments, our planeswalkers, our legendary sorceries, etc. Sigil and Shark Typhoon are both really solid finishers in our deck because not only can they create tokens a lot more easily than Ominous Seas can, but also these tokens have flying, and it's going to be really difficult for any opponent not to die to a huge evasive army in just a few turns. And, like most parts of our deck, where these finishers really shine is when we have an enchantress or two on the battlefield. That lets us cast some enchantments, draw into more enchantments, cast those, draw even more, creating a free army of meaty flyers all along the way. But really, to see our best finisher, you don't need to look any further than our shrines themselves. Once we get 6 shrines onto the battlefield and Sanctum of All starts doubling up their triggers, some of our payoff shrines can finish the game really quickly. Sanctum of Stonefangs is maybe our best shrine when it comes to actually finishing out the game. If we have 10 shrines on the battlefield, Sanctum of Stonefangs is going to be draining our opponents for 10 during each of our turns, and if that's doubled up by Sanctum of All, we're talking about draining half of their starting life total every single one of our turns. Similarly, once it's doubled up, Honden of Infinite Rage can let us snipe down multiple creatures per turn, but also it can just be turned at our opponent's faces to quickly burn them out of the game. And Honden of Life's Webs gives us a number of 1/1 spirits equal to the number of shrines we control. And once Sanctum of All doubles that up, so we're creating 12, 15, 20 tokens per turn, we can just start throwing all of our spirits at our opponents and just taking them out with some good old go-wide combat. And really, even without our specific finisher shrines, if we're able to get Sanctum of All's double trigger effect online, we're going to be generating so much value, it's going to be hard for anyone to keep up. Sanctum of All is basically our secret commander, and in our deck, a damn good commander at that. So that's going to wrap up our commander deck tech for budget shrines, but I'm going to take a few seconds here at the end to talk about potential upgrades you can make to the deck, if you want to spend a bit more than $75. The most frequently asked question I get in the comment section is recommendations for upgrades, so let's go ahead and cover a few. First and foremost, this is a 5-color deck on a budget, and that means we've had to make some concessions by playing a fair number of tap lands. Our deck is primarily a green-based deck with some good fixing thanks to that, so our mana isn't really bad as of now, but improving the mana base will make the deck run more smoothly, more consistently, and more powerfully. Fetch lands and shock lands are kind of the bread and butter of 5-color EDH decks, so if you've got any of those, or if you're looking at making a solid investment in the format, they're worth slotting into this deck for sure. The new tri-lands from Ikoria would also be solid upgrades to the budget tri-lands we're currently running, because the Ikoria tri-lands are fetchable thanks to having all 3 land types, and if we already have enough lands, we have the ability to just cycle them away. Teferi's Protection and Heroic Intervention would both be fantastic ways of protecting all of our shrines and the rest of our board against sweepers. Teferi's Protection is the absolute best, as it can just straight up also save us from death if our opponent has some sort of combo or big attack coming our way, but it's pretty expensive. Heroic Intervention is almost as good as Teferi's Protection, and it used to be super expensive as well, but it actually has just gotten reprinted and has dropped down to about $8, so it might be worth picking up now if you want a copy. You can slot out our copy of Soul of New Phyrexia for either of these, and it'll be a pretty huge improvement. Propaganda, Ghostly Prison, and Sphere of Safety are staples in enchantment-based commander decks, as they make it really difficult for our opponents to focus us down and kill us while we're dirtling around with all of our enchantments. Sphere of Safety in particular can make it almost impossible to attack us at all after a while, and I almost included it in our build of the deck, but I couldn't quite fit it in the budget. These 3 are all about $5, so they're not like mega expensive, but a bit too pricey for our build. A card I think would actually be bonkers in our deck is Dryad of the Iltzian Grove. Dryad is an enchantment creature, meaning he benefits from all of our enchantment payoffs. He also massively fixes our mana, letting all of our lands tap for mana of any color, which is huge in a 5-color deck like ours. And he lets us play an additional land per turn, and with all the card draw this deck is packing, it's really easy for us to take advantage of that and double up our land drops every turn. Dryad's about $10, so he's not cheap, but I think Dryad would be the one card I would spring for if I wanted to stretch the budget a bit. He just fits our deck super perfectly. Then there are some pricey Enchantress staples we could run, like our Gothian Enchantress, which is probably the single best Enchantress in the game, Enlightened Tutor as a 1-mana instant speed replacement for Idyllic Tutor, Sterling Grove to protect all of our shrines and all of our other enchantments, and Academy Rector to cheat any of our enchantments into play. Greater Oromancy, similar to Sterling Grove, is great protection for our enchantments. All the Pharaoh's Gods being both legendary and enchantments are definitely worth looking into for our deck, although I think Crewfix is maybe the best of the bunch for our deck, but just the fact that they're all legendary and enchantments means they're probably all worth taking a look at to see if they would fit well in our deck. Chromatic Lantern, just like Dryad of the Iltzian Grove, takes mana colors out of the equation and just lets us cast whatever we want, which again is super ultra mega good in a 5-color deck. And I would never recommend this miserable, horrible card, but if you hate your friends, you could also slot in Rhystic Study. Anyway, that's going to wrap it up for our video and for our budget Shrines Commander deck. So what do you think about the triumphant return of Shrines to Magic? Any secret shrine tech that you think I missed? Let me know. Anyway, this has been 2D, thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.